Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The Israel-Iran conflict has entered its 8th day with strikes and counter-strikes intensifying by both nations. As the violence escalates, all eyes are on Washington. Will the U.S. intervene directly, and if so, when? President Trump says the decision could come within 2 weeks. What might tip the balance in this high-stakes standoff? What are the key factors that could impact Trump's decision to intervene? And what role will advanced weaponry, regional alliances, and global diplomacy play in shaping what comes next? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, let's take a look at the latest. The air defense systems were activated in Tehran early Friday morning as loud, explosions were heard by local residents. So that's probably the routine, let's say, over the past week or so. For that discussion, we will have our guests. We have Dr. Jan Oberg, Director of Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, and Benjamin Norton, Founder and Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, and Professor Anna Rosario, Malindog-Uy, Director of the Vice President for External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute. Welcome to the show. Jan, I will start with you. So, how do you characterize the current situation? Is this a kind of a stalemate? We have this airstrike and then counter-strike. Do you see either side have any strategic advantage?
Let me say that I'm not an expert in any way on military matters. I'm a peace researcher. But what it looks like to me is that Iran this time is going to really fight back. And that may have surprised the Israelis. Secondly, I don't believe for a moment that Trump will wait 2 weeks. My judgment would be, and I've already written about it, he will do it very soon, and the U.S. will get involved. And much of what we see now looks to me like a repetition of the Iraq War. Fake stories, lies about the opponent, demonization, and building up. And, one of the things you never hear in Western media is that Israel is a nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And imagine that Trump would not get involved, but Israel would over time be really hard hit. He may say, okay, then I'm going to use nuclear weapons.
Wow, that's a very dark prospect, at least one of the possibilities.
What would you expect with such a nasty story that has nothing to do with reality, and with two nuclear powers throwing themselves out over one that does not have it? Mm-hmm. I see patterns from before.
Yeah, Ben, how do you look at that? Next 2 weeks, as the world basically waiting for the U.S. to make a decision, President Trump, whether the U.S. will intervene or not?
Well, I should say the U.S. is already involved. The question is whether or not the U.S. military will be directly bombing Iran. But Donald Trump has boasted of the fact that he's providing support to Israel. Israel is using U.S.-made planes and U.S. missiles. Middle East Eye reported that 3 days before Israel started this war, a war of aggression, on the 13th of June, 3 days before, the Trump administration delivered 300 Hellfire missiles to Israel that were used in the original surprise attack to eliminate the Iranian military leadership. We also know, the New York Times reported that the U.S. has been providing intelligence to Israel, helping it with targeting. So the U.S. government is already deeply involved. But now Trump has hinted pretty obviously that he's going to directly enter by bombing Iranian underground sites, likely using B-2 bombers, because that's what Israel doesn't have. And the U.S. plans to use these giant bunker buster bombs. And Trump has hinted that it could happen within 2 weeks. But the Wall Street Journal already reported that Trump has approved the operation and the military is simply waiting for the order. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh reported, citing U.S. and Israeli officials, that Trump could do it in the next few days. And he even said that Trump may plan it when Wall Street closes the market so as not to disrupt Wall Street, the capital markets during the weekend when they're closed. Mm-hmm. So it seems almost certain that the U.S. government will get directly involved. But again, I need to stress that the U.S. has been involved from the very beginning. And there are many reports that Trump personally gave Netanyahu the green light to start this war.
Right. Anna, for people like you and me, the East Asia, when we look at that, what are at stake?
I think just to respond also to your previous question, if the United States will be involved directly in the Iran and Israel military conflict, and what would be the implication of that in the world and even in Asia Pacific, because we're part of Asia Pacific. I think, as I agree with Ben, that the United States is already involved. As you can see, when it comes to military assets, especially high-level military assets, the source of Israel, these kind of military assets are, in terms of sources, it's from the United States as far as Israel is concerned. So indirectly, yes, the U.S. is already involved, I think. And when you talk about direct involvement anytime soon, probably in the next 2 weeks, we will see it. I think it would be from the looks of it, if in any case the U.S. would really get involved, it would be more on airstrike or missile attacks. Well, if this conflict would escalate further as it is now, I think in terms of impact, it will impact economically across the world and the Asia Pacific region. Probably there will be, I think it's already happening, there will be an oil price hike, and countries like mine, the Philippines, which is very much dependent on import of oil, would most likely be affected because inflation would go up, and the whole world will be affected, especially countries like the Philippines who are import dependent on oil. So this is pretty much the picture as this military conflict most likely would escalate, especially if the U.S. will get involved directly, and it will not be just a regional conflict. I think other powers other powers or major powers will get involved as well.
Tell us more, Anna, what do you refer to? Other powers or regional powers that will also react, to the U.S. direct, U.S. bombing of Iran?
I think when you talk about an escalation of conflict, especially if in any case the United States will directly get involved, and if in any case Trump will, decide that it will strike Iran in whatever way, may it be airstrike or a missile attack. It depends really on the situation the next 2 weeks. When I say that, other major powers will get involved, we have to look at Iran. Iran is not alone, I think. There are sympathetic major powers like, for example, Russia, Turkey, and I'm not sure about China, but on the other hand, also the U.S. has the so-called Western Alliance, and even countries in Europe, especially Germany, France, and United Kingdom, are very much sympathetic to the so-called cause of Israel, that it's rhetoric and war rhetorics that is being spread out, that Iran is somewhat an existential threat against Iran because of development of nuclear weapon, which is until now, after 30 years, it has no basis at all. It never had existed to a greater extent. Yeah.
Right. Picking up of what Anna mentioned about other powers might get involved directly or indirectly. Let's take a look. The Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, he tweeted earlier that he will have a meeting with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy to discuss the conflict between Israel and Iran. The U.S. and the UK agree Iran should never get a nuclear weapon. People are suspecting that whether the U.S. is trying to build the so-called coalition of the willing, together with their European partners, and launch bombing against Iran. Is that, something you think might happen?
I think that would depend quite a lot on what the situation will be when the United States has gone in full force on the side of Israel. Secondly, of course, they would prepare for that eventuality, like in Iraq. And I think that is as bad as it can be, but very much as what we're talking about as of now, at this moment, is very speculative. I'm a little bit more interested in also discussing how this war already is sold by the media in the West, because it's very deceptive.
Yeah.
It's a series of misinformation. It's the omission of Israel and what it has done. I'll give you one extreme example. The Danish UN ambassador at the Security Council made a speech in which she said, we are totally behind, we Denmark are totally behind the view that Iran shall never get a nuclear weapon. Now, this was as if this was international law. Who has told Iran not to have it? Secondly, I don't think from my experience in Iran that they want to have it, but they can be forced to have it now. But would you believe that this woman, representing a decent European country, does not mention Israel's attack? Mm-hmm. Her speech starts with saying Iran can never get a nuclear weapon. Then comes a lot of blah blah about Iran having violated the JCPOA and God knows what. You know, everything is now black and white again. After you've seen the occupations and bombings of Israel in neighboring countries, after you've seen a genocide. I mean, people still believe that you could expect some kind of decency or normal behavior from Israel and its leader, Netanyahu. I'm sorry, but I am not that naive. Everything could happen.
What about the response in general from European countries? You're talking about Denmark. What about, the German Chancellor, Merz, said Israel is doing the dirty job for us, for the West. What do you make of that?
I make out of it that we have totally left rational analysis. We have left rationality behind. We have left honesty behind. The West is in deep trouble everywhere, and what the West is still strongest at is the military, and that's why everything is turned into a military conflict. This could have been solved long ago. The reason we are where we are today is Israel's policies and the fact that Donald Trump took out the United States from the JCPOA, which was a fantastic piece of diplomatic success. Now, this man is very guilty for what is happening at the moment. And when I hear somebody talking this way, unconditional surrender to a nation of 90 million people being attacked, then I say we're close to fascism. This is a fascist state.
One thing more, when we refer to the Ukraine conflict, European countries, the preferred line is like, violation of international law, unprovoked attack. But nowadays, they don't even mention, it's Israel that first launched attack against Iran.
Well, that's why I'm telling you, there's no principle, no decency, and no ethics anymore in this system. And of course, this will also put the Ukrainian thing in the shadow if we have a big war in the Middle East. Yeah. And so it's up in the air what is going to happen. I just say that I see elements of this preparation, this kind of, building up to it that I also saw in Iraq. And I say, God forbid.
Right, and let's take a look at, of course, the development response, from the Israeli side. For example, Israel's defense minister has issued a stark warning that Iran's supreme leader Khamenei can no longer be allowed to exist. The threat came after a hospital was hit in an Iranian missile strike on Thursday. So Ben, let's take a look first, and then we have Ben to respond.
We have set the goals of the war, and the goals of the war are to remove the nuclear threat, the threats of destruction, and to thwart the missile threat. And as a part of this, the IDF was instructed and knows that in order to achieve all the goals, such a man can no longer be allowed to exist.
Well, Ben, obviously, Trump also said that, is easy target. I mean, Khamenei is an easier target. That means like they can basically take him out if they want to do, probably at any point of time. But what will be the consequence? I mean, and what condition they think, well, okay, they have the right or they can do it?
I mean, we're talking about rogue states here, the U.S. and Israel, that are threatening to kill the top government official in a foreign sovereign state that is recognized by the United Nations. On his Twitter copy website, which is called Truth Social, Trump tweeted a direct threat to the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and he used the word kill. And Trump said, well, we're not going to kill him right now, but we could kill him in the near future. He's talking about the leader of a sovereign country. And this comes after, in January 2020, Donald Trump assassinated the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, which was an act of war. It was actually Iran that showed significant restraint, whereas the US and Israel have been just constantly violating international law, carrying out these constant acts of war. Let's not forget that Israel has repeatedly attacked Iran, Iranian territory, including recently, Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Syria, which was an act of war against Iran. And Iran did respond proportionately, but it's constantly the US and Israel that are escalating and violating international law. And every time Iran responds proportionately, according to its rights, according to international law, the Western powers accuse Iran absurdly of supposedly being the aggressor. We've seen statements from, for instance, Emmanuel Macron, the French president. He immediately condemned Iran after Iran responded to Israel's act of war. And then Macron said Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, does Iran have a right to defend itself? The Western leaders never mention Iran's right to defend itself, but that is very clear in international law. Iran is defending itself. It's the US and Israel that are the aggressors here. And of course, for my entire lifetime, the US has been at war in this region. The US waged war on Iraq twice. The US waged war on Syria. The US led the NATO war that destroyed the Libyan state and killed Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, in 2011. The US just a few months ago was bombing Yemen. So, I mean, what we see again and again is that the US and Israel violate international law, wage these wars of aggression, and there are unfortunately no consequences for them, largely because the US has abused its veto power in the UN Security Council to make sure there are no consequences.
Well, Ben, I'm glad you mentioned about the international law. You know, I noticed that in a very unfortunate development that is, say, Western leaders, including those scholars, like inside the U.S., when they are discussing whether the U.S. should go in or not, few people mention, you know, what's the justification? According to international law, according to international principle, because Iran is another sovereign nation. If the U.S. go in and bomb this nation, you have to have enough reason, or you have to gain the approval of the UN Security Council. Does that matter anymore, or not matter, probably?
Well, it should matter, but unfortunately what we've seen is that the U.S. government consistently, not just under Donald Trump, for many decades, has ignored international law when it serves its political interests. Let's not forget, under George W. Bush in 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it was an act of war. It was an aggressive war. And the top UN official, the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, said very clearly that that was a war of aggression that violated the UN Charter. So we've seen this again and again. And let's not forget that when we're talking about international law, there was a diplomatic agreement that was overseen by the United Nations that was signed a decade ago, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And that was not only signed by the US and Iran, it was signed by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and it was signed by the European Union and Germany, and it was written into international law through a UN Security Council resolution that the Obama administration actually voted for. And then when Trump came in his first term in 2018, he tore up that agreement unilaterally. He withdrew from the agreement, and in violation of international law, he imposed sanctions on Iran. And now the U.S. claims their pretext, which again is absurd, is they say that Iran is a nuclear threat. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. There is one country in West Asia that does have nuclear weapons. It's called Israel, which is not a signatory of the NPT, unlike Iran. And what we see is that the U.S. is carrying out all of these actions that actually make it much more likely that in the future Iran would pursue nuclear weapons, because every time Iran has gone to the negotiating table and signed an agreement, the U.S. has torn it up, or in the most recent case, Iran participated in 5 rounds of talks with the Trump administration, and we now know, media outlets citing U.S. officials have acknowledged that this was part of a strategy that the U.S. was trying to trick Iran into think that it would not be attacked. But meanwhile, while U.S. diplomats were meeting with Iranian officials, they were actually planning to start this war. So why would Iran ever return to the negotiating table? The U.S. and Israel have just killed the Iranian negotiators who were the ones who were supposed to negotiate the deal.
Right. I mean, of course, I was thinking of, people are talking about the chances whether there will be happening, and that is the return to the negotiation table between U.S. and Iran. Given what Ben has said, is there any chance that the Iranians will say, okay, we agree to continue or resume the discussion with the United States in terms of the nuclear issue, despite all that happened from Israel?
Is it me? Are you asking,
Anna,
right?
please, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I think in terms of pursuit of the negotiation and probably the de-escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel, and with this kind of issue or possibilities, I think Iran will only be willing to sit down again and to talk with the United States or even with anyone or any kind of mediation that can possibly happen between Iran and Israel and to de-escalate conflict. If in any case Iran will see that, Israel would stop attacking Iran, and if Iran would see that there's such a thing as sincerity, and also there will be really, they can see that it's not only by words but even actions. Because as far as we are concerned, as far as Iran is concerned, talks without action will never resolve the issue at the moment. I think that is pretty much what I can see. It has to be based on action, and Israel should stop attacking Iran. And I think that's the only way that Iran will go back to the negotiating table, and I think that's the only way for this conflict to de-escalate. However, let me just comment quickly with the issue that probably there would be an attempt of assassination against the Iran supreme leader.
Yes.
I think this is a very dangerous proposal or any kind of idea that's on the table right now, that a leader of a superpower like the United States have been mentioned or said in media, precisely because this would definitely, if this happens, this would definitely make Khamenei become a martyr, uniting the whole of Iran, the population of Iran. And also this would be one of the most explosive geopolitical actions of the 21st century. It would not just provoke retaliation, it would almost certainly trigger a region-wide conflict or conflagration, destabilize the global markets, and probably would radicalize Iran's internal political systems further. So this would definitely trigger an existential act of war on the part of Iran, of course, and other players in the region. So this is a very dangerous idea that is now circulating in media, and even, and being entertained by Trump at the moment. This is really crazy.
Yan, the Ayatollah Sistani from Iraq, the neighboring country, has warned against such an action, capitulation. And also, let's say, Hezbollah, the new leader, also warned against such a possibility. Russia has said that they will react negatively, strongly to such a scenario. So there will be consequences, let's say. I mean, at least we can say the situation will be very much worsened.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that it will be much worse than what we have seen so far. And that was what I predicted in my article 4 days ago, that the US will get involved. What strikes me sometimes is not what we talk about, because, as I said, it's very speculative. What strikes me is what we don't talk about. Have you noticed that both in the Ukraine war and in this war, there's nobody mentioning the United Nations, which is the peace organization of the world? There's nobody who talks about mediation. We don't have mediators. No foreign minister or prime minister has any advisors in terms of conflict resolution, mediation, calming down, reconciliation, and things like that.
Well, Russian President Putin did offer to mediate, but was rejected by Trump, remember?
Yeah, but I mean, this goes since the Bosnian Wars. The United Nations, which turns 80 this year, is totally marginalized. That's the organization that has the capacity for both peacekeeping and ceasefire monitoring, etc. I'm not saying it can be put in right now, but I'm just saying, why is nobody talking about the world's most important organization?
Yeah. Well, we did mention, probably you were offline. We talked.
I was off for a
with
little
Ben,
while.
we talked
Sorry.
about the UN principle, the international law in the UN Security Council, because the U.S. was a veto member. If you bring this case to the UN Security Council, obviously that will be vetoed. I mean, as we have seen in the resolutions related to Israel, often vetoed by the U.S. and other their partner countries. But anyway, let's have Ben. Ben, if you look at the situation now, strikes, counter-strikes, there's a possibility, as people are saying, that Israel or Iran might at a certain point run out of ammunition, run out of missiles or interceptors. And then that will be a ceasefire, basically, at the end of exhaustion?
Well, again, it's hard to predict these things. I will say that, Israel has basically as many weapons and ammunition and missiles as the U.S. gives it. Let's keep in mind that the Biden administration gave Israel more than $20 billion in military aid, and Trump has only continued giving more and more missiles and support. So Israel will continue this war as long as it wants and as long as the U.S. continues to provide it support. The only way that Israel can wage war is because it has the support of the United States. This has been acknowledged regularly by Israeli officials. Top Israeli military officials told the major newspaper Haaretz that if the U.S. were to withdraw support for their war in Gaza, then the war would end in a week or two because they simply cannot carry out this war. This isn't even to mention the political and diplomatic support that the U.S. has provided to Israel in the United Nations. And I will say, this was mentioned earlier, the role of the UN, which should be the main organization pushing for peace. I will say there are some countries, especially China and Brazil and many BRICS countries, that have called for strengthening the voice of the United Nations as a peacemaking institution. And this is why China constantly emphasizes that we need the international law-based order, not this vague idea that Western politicians talk about the rules-based order, and they never say what those rules are because they're actually trying to replace international law with the rules they make. China and BRICS countries have made it clear that the international law-based order has its center in the United Nations, and we should empower and reform the UN so more global South countries have more influence, and so the Western powers, they can still be represented, but they shouldn't have this disproportionate influence. So I think what we see is that with all of these conflicts in the world, we see a paralysis in these international institutions that have been more and more dominated by the U.S. and the Western powers more generally. And what they show is that we have a desperate need for reform. And this is what global South countries have called for many decades. But the failure to stop the war in Ukraine, the failure to stop the genocide in Gaza, and now the failure to stop this war in Iran, all are so clear examples of why we need a true multilateral system in the world and we need fundamental reform.
Ben, just to follow up briefly, do you think given the influence of the U.S. as the largest country, most powerful country, and of course, given their talk of assassinating the national leader of another sovereign nation, are you seeing that we are entering this period of almost like a lawlessness or law of jungle? 30 seconds.
Unfortunately, yes, but I will say for many countries, it's been like this for decades. I mean, if you look at Latin America, the U.S. has invaded and intervened in many countries in Latin America, carrying out coups and regime change operations. Even in the case of Iran, let's not forget, in 1953, the CIA backed a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And then, of course, the U.S. waged war on Korea and Vietnam and Iraq 2 times and Syria. So unfortunately, we've seen a kind of law of the jungle for many decades for much of the global South. But what's concerning is now these wars are expanding further and further and drawing in major powers, and that's even more dangerous.
Yeah, more dangerous. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xin Duo. See you next time.